Hi everybody, Joanna here. Welcome to my recent read slash wrap up video for the books I read in September and the first half of October. So the first book I'll be talking about is a reread book, and that first book is Stoner by John Williams. So this follows the journey, the life of a man named William Stoner as he deals with trials in his home life, his marriage, and his academic career. In some ways, this could almost be a dark academia book. It's following the journey of somebody who falls in love with academia, who falls in love with literature. And then slowly over time, we start to see the darker parts of academia. But at the same time, it doesn't have the dark academia, gothic, messy aesthetic that's associated with that genre. So it doesn't really fall into that category. But I personally love this book. I guess I'm an honorary dude bro because this was my favorite book of 2022. It held up upon reread as a favorite. I particularly love the questions that are explored in this book regarding marriage and love, discovery of self and passion, what it means to live with regret, to lead a successful life, and about compromise along the way. And so I think that this is such a layered book. I felt like I saw more and more deeply into this character upon reread. And the reason I reread it is because I wanted to prepare or refresh my thoughts for this wonderful discussion I had with my friends, with Jimmy and Murphy and Alan and Philip. And part of the reason is because Jimmy, Alan, and I loved this book so much that we kind of coerced Murphy and Philip into reading it. And we had a wonderful discussion. It was really one of my favorite book discussions in some ways. Well, it was one of my favorite books and then some of my favorite people. So it made sense that it was going to be a fantastic discussion. But that's over on Alan's channel. Murphy hosted it, but it's posted on Alan's channel, so highly recommend checking that out if you want spoiler-filled thoughts. But if you want spoiler-free thoughts, I do have a video here on my channel on both Augustus and Stoner, so you could hear more thoughts there. The next book is also a reread, and that is A Dance with Dragons by George R. R. Martin, Book 5 in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think that this particular book has a slightly different approach. I think we get a different approach actually in books 4 and 5 than books 1 through 3. And there were some structural choices with that, the way that Martin decided to divide books 4 and 5. I don't want to get in depth about that here, but I'll just say that I did find the reading experience a little bit different in book 5 than the previous books. It took me a long time to read book 5, and this was in no way a bad thing. I think part of the reason it was a slower build for me is because of the way it was structured. So, Martin is a genius in almost every way of writing, in my opinion. But one of the strengths I think he has as a writer is his ability to write each chapter almost like a short story in and of itself. So, you're following different perspectives, different characters for each chapter, and each chapter is named after the character you're following. But each character or each chapter is structured in such a way, especially in A Dance with Dragons, where we're starting out kind of slow and we're building a lot of world elements. We're expanding the world. So there's a lot that's described as far as culture, oddities, creatures, or just general world building in different settings, while also highlighting specific aspects of the character. And there are some new characters in A Dance with Dragons. So it was a little bit of a slow build starting each chapter, but then each chapter builds into something really exciting and climactic. And then the chapter would end either on a cliffhanger or just with an exciting moment in the story. But then we go into the next chapter where we start all over again with that process with a different perspective. Also, I have to say, magic is on full display in book 5. If you think of the first book, A Game of Thrones, as more just historical fantasy or low fantasy, I would say that is definitely not the case. By the time you get to book 5, there is quite a bit there. And I thoroughly loved this book, especially upon reread, because I think that when you reread a series like this or any book, you could start to look at it in different ways and start to question why Martin chose the perspectives he did, at least in this particular story or in this particular book, and what he's trying to say in terms of theme. Because if you look at two character perspectives, you start to look at their challenges or struggles with leadership in two different ways, in two different parts of the world, with two very different cultural views of freedom. And there were some really pivotal moments in the book. There were several moments where characters are literally putting one foot in front of the other, just trying to survive. And I also appreciated the variety of setting again because we do get such an expansion on world building. I love these books. I love all five. I really get upset, like many fans, about the fact that the books get conflated with the show quite a bit. I do recommend this series if you love epic fantasy, and if you've only watched the show, then I highly encourage you to give the books a try. There's probably a lot more I could say about this particular book and series, but I did do a spoiler filled discussion if you want to hear some more thoughts about A Dance with Dragons. All right, next book, another reread, another epic fantasy reread too, and that is Midnight Tides by Stephen Erickson, book 5 in Malazan Book of the Fallen. I should get my copy. Okay, Midnight Tides. This book is quite the experience, especially as a first time reader. Now, this was my reread, but when you read this series the first time, it could be a little bit of an adjustment being on a whole new continent in book 5 in an epic fantasy series with an almost entirely new cast of characters. And so I remember that being a bit of an adjustment when I read this book the first time. It was smoother upon reread, but this particular book, I think, still the parts to me that were significant the first time were still significant to me upon reread. And it's also interesting to look at some of those themes from a broader perspective after you've finished the series because they tie in a different way. But in this particular book, I would say that we're dealing with themes such as contrasting cultures. You see the theme of brotherhood, of power dynamics between mortals and gods. You also see slavery, possession, trauma, healing from trauma, imperialism, colonization, reciprocity. I love this book because it goes into depth with a society you're introduced to in this book, the Lethery culture, which is pretty much a capitalist culture without Stephen Erickson saying the word capitalism. And because of that, this book actually got me to think about our world in a way that maybe most other fantasy had not gotten me to think about our world. I just really loved the way that he played on that particular theme, as well as this idea that that's just the natural law or that's just the natural way people are. I think it's almost similar to the idea that humans are naturally selfish, that there is no true altruism, that kind of idea. He doesn't say it exactly like that, but I feel like there are ways of looking at the narrative that way. So again, just like with The Dance with Dragons, it was really interesting to read this book, think about the larger picture of the series, and also think about why Erickson chose the characters he chose for this particular book, why he chose to create certain relationships the way he did. It was interesting though, because of course, it had been a couple of years and I had forgotten certain details about this book when I reread it. It all flooded back as soon as I started rereading it. But what was interesting for me is that after I finished the book, I went back and I watched my video on this, my spoiler filled video, and it was a little cringy. There were a couple of minor mistakes I said in that video, but I noticed that all the things that were most significant to me, most meaningful to me the first time I read this book were the same things that were meaningful to me upon reread. They were the same things that really stood out to me. My favorite chapter, I think it's chapter 11. I remember that being very powerful for me the first time I read this book and going back and rereading certain passages in that chapter over and over again. And upon reread, I felt like that chapter was still super significant to me. And I was able to even go back and look at the epigraph in a different way and the way that the chapter started compared to how it ended and seeing connections there. So there are so many different little connections you can make in Malazan that, and that's part of what I love about this series. But it is an emotional journey too. This was such an emotional book for me in so many ways. This definitely held up upon reread. I did reread it via audio this time. And I think I will read it again in the future someday because I think these themes are just going to continue to resonate with me. The Revenge of the Rose is Elric Saga Volume 2, story number 2. So, this is my sixth Elric story I've read about this sickly albino sorcerer, Elric, a Melnibonan, and he has a magical sword, Stormbringer. Highly recommend this series if you enjoy sword and sorcery. The stories are fairly short, and I would say that the plot is pretty straightforward in each of the stories. I don't feel like that's the most unique thing when it comes to Elric. I feel like there's just a lot of pure imagination in these stories, which is why I enjoy them. I recently heard Liam from Liam's Lyceum talk about how Elric, being the sickly creature he is a direct contrast to Conan from Robert E. Howard's Conan series, Conan the Barbarian. And I thought that was a really interesting point because I do think Elric, for me, in some ways reminds me of 80s hair metal, where there's a little bit of an androgynous quality to his character. And it's almost a little bit of a critique of masculinity as far as like the barbarian type of masculinity. And I felt like we got that a little bit in this particular story, The Revenge of the Rose, because Elric is reflecting a lot about his past, about how his people were a people of conquest, but how that might not have always been what drove his people. And he longs for that. He longs for a different way of approaching life that's not all about greed and conquest, kind of similar to what I was talking about with Midnight Tides a little bit. But yeah, there's a deep longing in him for something more meaningful, I think, for a deeper type of love and serenity and hope that might surprise people, as people always talk about Elric being the anti Tolkien. I'll just very briefly say that this particular story, The Revenge of the Rose, is Elric trying to find his father's soul, which has been hidden or lost. He has clues as to where it is, so he's on this journey to go and retrieve it. Otherwise, he runs the risk of being forged with his father's soul for eternity, which kind of raises the stakes, I guess, for an immortal creature because that's Elric's version of hell. In addition to like what I was saying before about the idea of conquest, we definitely see that recur throughout the story. This idea of people at the top enslaving people at the bottom to create this machine like civilization that feeds on itself. So you see that represented in the story. And I have to say, though, that while this story immediately gripped me, perhaps a little bit more strongly than many of the Elric stories I've read before, I did find that some of the reflective passages and some of the explorations on that theme got a little bit repetitive for me or just a little long-winded for me, and I am somebody who usually lives for that kind of stuff. I usually love the navel gazing, as some people call it. I love stories like that that really go deep into reflection and into philosophy, but I just found myself a little less engaged with it after a while. And then the end was really good. I actually was very surprised how beautifully it came together at the end and even had some touching moments. So I'll probably continue Elric in the future. I'm not in an immediate rush to continue to the next story, but I'm glad to be reading them. I think it's interesting just to see how influential they've been on other stories in fantasy, including The Witcher, for example. And they are different, I think, than many people would expect, like I said, given the reputation that this author has as being the anti-Tolkien. Babel 17 is a sci-fi book by Samuel Delany that was written in the 1960s and that explores language. So in this particular space opera, Earth is being invaded and the invaders are using a language, Babel 17, as a weapon. In order to get a hold of what this language is about, understand it, they hire this poetress, Rydra Wong, who is a captain of a ship, and she is also very multi talented, extremely talented, not only at poetry, but when it comes to languages as well. She's basically a prodigy. And you follow her as she gathers a crew together for her ship in order to discover where this language is coming from. She's also just genuinely curious about this language. She's a brilliant character because she's charming, she's charismatic, she's beautiful. And at the same time, there are layers to her that Samuel Delany reveals in alternate chapters. So you get a chapter of her where she's interacting with a certain character and you get the sense of just how confident she is and how wonderful she is, how intelligent she is. And then you'll get a contrasting chapter where you get inside her mind and you find out her experience and see her vulnerabilities. And I thought it was so well handled, so interesting. But I thought that there was a lot of really interesting humor in this story too. So there's a whole entire chapter where Rydra Wong is going around gathering her crewmen. She finds discorporate beings in order to be some of her crewmen. In order to find her perfect pilot of her airship, she goes to a wrestling match and she explains how somebody who is very skilled at wrestling will be a very skilled pilot. And it's just so much fun. It was so much fun to see her get together her ragtag group of people for her crew, for her ship. And then to explore language the way that this book explored it was absolutely so well done. It explores this idea that with language, if you only know one language and only have one word for one concept, that might cause some blind spots in your own consciousness. An example might be if you were to look at trees and perhaps you were not able to distinguish between different types of trees, all trees were just trees to you, whereas somebody else who was a specialist could tell you the difference between a pine and an oak and a linden tree and a mulberry tree, all the different varieties of trees and understanding their needs or their different needs, the different climates, where they're native to, so many different distinctions. So, having that language or having that ability to distinguish things in that way because of language would help you to have a broader understanding of the topic. It would have a deeper impact on your consciousness overall, and so I think that is one angle that the book is exploring language, but there are other ones as well, including the idea that invasions or wars might be ways in which we are made to understand others in ways that we wouldn't otherwise, or merge with others that we might otherwise just coexist beside without really getting to interact or know. So I feel like there were different ways that we look at language in this book, and I appreciated the character moments. I appreciated the world building and the humor. And it is a very distinct flavor of sci fi I would associate with 1960s sci fi. So again, it's more minimal in all its descriptions of these things. But I thought it was a lot of fun and very touching at times too, surprisingly touching at times, I should say. Caliban's Hour by Tad Williams was my introduction to Tad Williams. And by the cover of this, it might look like monster smut. It is not monster smut, though. This is based on The Tempest by Shakespeare. And I actually watched a production of The Tempest a couple of weeks ago by the Royal Shakespeare Company online with subtitles. That is my favorite way to consume Shakespeare, by the way. I like watching the plays while reading the subtitles. That way, I feel like I'm actually reading Shakespeare's play, but I'm getting some theatrical context at the same time. And that production was so good. The acting was phenomenal. There was incredible music, incredible visual effects. I was actually very touched at times, which I wasn't expecting. But this particular book, like I said, it's based on The Tempest. It takes place several years later. I won't go into depth about The Tempest, but I'll just quickly say that we follow Prospero, former Duke of Milan, who's been usurped by his brother Antonio. And Prospero has his daughter, his teenage daughter Miranda, there on the island. And they have a servant named Caliban. Caliban was born from a witch. And Prospero also has a servant, Ariel, who's a fae magic creature who does his work for him. Caliban in The Tempest seemed kind of like a comic relief type of character. And I actually found it kind of pitiful watching The Tempest, thinking about him, especially after reading this book. So I felt like I understand why Williams decided to focus on this character because he doesn't get a lot of development. Like I said, he's mostly there for comic relief. This book takes place several years later after Prospero has come back to Milan. He's dead now at this point. His daughter Miranda is a mother. She's living in the palace. Her husband is away. Her youngest daughter is going to be wed soon and is not happy about that. She also has a very young son. And Caliban comes to the palace at night. He climbs up the wall, he scales the walls, and he comes into Miranda's bedroom when she's alone in bed. And he tells her, I'm going to kill you, but first you're going to hear my tale. And he talks about his whole story as he was on the island with his mother, what it was like to meet Miranda and her father when they first arrived. A few quick things to say about this. It's very short. There are illustrations. I found the prose a bit cringy at the beginning of this book, and I was really nervous. I was not going to like it. I just thought it seemed a little bit contrived, maybe like an author trying to sound Shakespearean. I just didn't quite buy it. But then as I read on, for whatever reason, I found myself completely captivated by the story and I didn't want to put it down. So I actually enjoyed my time with it. It's probably not Williams's best work. I never hear about it, probably for good reason, but I still had a good time with it and it still made me very excited to read more from Tad Williams. So I'm sure I will enjoy his other books. But this was a really, like I said, enjoyable, maybe palate cleanser type of story because it was so short and it is a framed narrative, which I tend to enjoy. And I would say if you are interested in The Tempest, I would say pick it up because it does get you to think about this character more in depth. And I appreciated that Tad Williams brought attention to this character, especially as I feel like he could have had so much more development in The Tempest. And it also got me to enjoy The Tempest as well. So I'm glad for that. Now for a new favorite, Pet Cemetery by Stephen King. This book follows Lewis Creed, who is in his mid 30s. He and his wife Rachel and two small kids and cat Church move to a new town. They move to Ludlow, Maine to start a new chapter of their life. They move into a large manor on a large plot of land. And it's on a street where these big trucks occasionally drive by really fast. There's an elderly couple across the street, and the elderly man ends up telling Lewis and his family about a nearby pet cemetery. This book explores death and grief, but with a horror twist. One of the things that I personally found interesting about this book is that the character Lewis Creed starts out in the book being rather pessimistic. He's a little bit hard around the edges, a little bit hard to warm up to. He doesn't seem like he's somebody starting a new chapter in a positive way. He seems a little anxious about it, a little bit pessimistic. But then, as death becomes prominent in the story, as things start to come to the forefront on that topic, I feel like King starts to show this character's vulnerable side and in that way soften his character and maybe warm the reader up to the character as we go on this crazy journey with him as he explores these topics, as he's confronted with these very difficult situations, confronting death and grief and the supernatural. I think that it was the way it was set up that made it so effective. Another thing I appreciated at the very beginning of the story was when Lewis and his family go into the pet cemetery, there's a description of Lewis and his wife Rachel going under the arch and instinctively reaching for each other's hands as though they were in a wedding ceremony. I felt like that conjured the perfect imagery for what this couple is going to go through in this story. It was like the perfect induction into this supernatural horror that they're going to be going through throughout the story. Another thing I loved in the beginning of the book, I should say, is there was a wonderful conversation between Lewis and his daughter where he's trying to explain that yes, cats and animals die or usually die before humans do, that your cat probably will not outlive you. And the way he has this conversation with his daughter was perfect. It was exactly how I'd imagine a doctor, an adult doctor character to explain this topic to their young kid. Another thing I really loved at the beginning of the book related to that scene was this marital fight between Lewis and his wife Rachel, where they're having this heated argument about death and about how to explain that to their child. And it seemed as though, of course, well, we know when we read this book and why later on, but his wife, Rachel, gets very emotional about this topic. And Lewis is trying to talk to her not from a place of emotion and reflecting back to her and validating what she's feeling. He's trying to speak to her from a place of reason. And you can totally understand as a reader why they're clashing the way that they're clashing and why this isn't going to go in a positive direction. And they even use strong language you're not supposed to use. I've heard that before to try and avoid words like never and always when it comes to your partner, when it comes to a criticism, especially. But it was such a heated argument and yet so convincing, especially the way that you understood where both characters were coming from based on their pasts. But I was really most impressed with the way grief was explored, even the way time, perception of time changes when you're enduring grief and the ways it can change you as a person, change your perception, make you do things that are irrational. And it was so good. Again, the way that that was deeply connected to the supernatural and the horror, it was deeply disturbing. And King even says in the forward of this book, it was the most frightening book he's ever written. This was definitely a home run for me. One of the best books on grief I've ever read. I should go ahead and mention that the reason I picked this book up was because a few weeks ago I was watching Chatting with Nuts with Jimmy and his friend Andrew from Dudes Talking Manga. And everyone in the chat was recommending fantasy books to Andrew. But Andrew happened to mention loving Pet Cemetery on audio with Michael C. Hall's narration. Michael C. Hall is the actor from Dexter and 6 Feet Under. So I got excited about picking this up for spooky season. And it was just the perfect recommendation for this time of year. because listening to this while the weather was changing, while it was rainy outside and dreary, it was just the perfect reading experience for me. I should also mention that I did watch the movie from the 80s back when I was a kid 2 times, so I was pretty much spoiled for everything, but of course, the book did go way deeper into the psychology of grief, at least as far as I can remember compared to the movie. And so I highly recommend the book, even if you are spoiled for what happens. And that is it. Those are the books I read recently. Please let me know in the comment section below if you've read any of these books or if you're planning to read any of these books. I would love to hear from you and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.